Welcome back to the second day of this wonderful conference on service past. Across time, that is the panel discussion this morning. What does service mean in early India, in the middle centuries, in modern times? And we have a set of panelists who really need no introduction. We have Professor Uma Chakravarti, historian of early India on caste and gender, and also legendary teacher. From Delhi University, we have Professor Sunil Kumar from Delhi University, medieval historian of the Delhi Sultanate centuries. Also with interest in architecture and monumentality. And we have Professor Samita Sen from Kolkata, from Chakravarti University, a leader in the setting up of the Center for Gender Studies in Jadavpur, and a historian of labor and gender. So, if I may take the simple path of starting with Uma, talking of early India, and if I could request you all to speak for about 20-25 minutes each, and followed by a set of responses, followed by you speaking again. Hopefully today, because we are talking of service across time, we would be also able to attend to the nuances of what the term service actually means in a set of South Asian languages. So, what is it to talk about das or das vritti? What is it to talk about, as Sunil might talk about, naukari or chakari or bandagi from your forthcoming essay? What is it to go into wage labor, casted wage labor, and so on and so forth? So, please, Uma.
So, I don't even have a scrap of paper for a change. I always have my notes. But I have had time to specifically write down a few points. And I'm reminded of an anecdote that was announced on Irfan that he never had a scrap of note. He used to have a piece of paper to give the impression that he had actually planned his lecture, but it was often the to-be list. I'm afraid I'm actually the opposite. I always have my notes. I always have talked about my life and always had my notes, but I've become such a quick change artist that I have to reinvent myself every morning for some new job. And I haven't had time to write the few notes that I should have. I carried my material with me on the last trip, arrived at 11 o'clock, and this morning I couldn't find the paper. so very sorry, but I do know what I wanted to say and some of the ideas. And let me begin with the fact that actually the problem, as anyone who works with ancient or medieval Indian, especially ancient Indian texts, is that actually the categories are something that do not conform to the way in which we think of categories for the parallel period, even in early Europe, but certainly when we think of something like servants and service, even service, it's tough to actually look at the material that you have and figure out what precisely is the frame that one could use in identifying the history of that concept or the history of that way of understanding that we have now got through our contemporary location, but particularly through 19th century and earlier on. I hope that Sunil will also help us to clarify some of this. So the categories that there are categories that define people who provide service. There's no doubt about that. There is an interesting way in which certain categories are clubbed together and written in the narrative descriptive texts. I am referring to the Buddhist texts. The Buddhist texts actually are much better than the Brahmanical texts because they have narratives attached to whatever points that they're wanting to make. So there is some kind of social reflection in the way in which the narratives move. And so you do get some issues that I will come to it later. But there is a way in which various categories of service seem to be clubbed together in the Pali terms Dasa, Karmakara, Porisa. And Kamakara and Purisa, because they in Pali you don't have the same takshar, and because you don't have the same takshar, one word doubles for the other. So it's not Karmakara, it's Kamakara. So this is the category that's often put together as a threesome, not as Dasa or Kamakara or Purisa separately. And if you look at it, it seems to me that the way in which one can understand this is that actually how we are thinking of clarified terminology to exist for that time is not something that is easy for us to completely discern. So the Dasa, for instance, which is the most popular of these three terms and appears as a descriptive category for various people are named that when you refer to someone by name, the qualifying Dasa can be attached to it, so that one knows that he is performing, he, she, a Dasi is performing some form of labor. But then to consider that there is domestic labor and a separation between domestic labor and field labor is actually very much more complicated. So the idea of household and performance of labor within the household, and the fact that that is distinct from a category of work that exists where you might perform labor on the field is not something that's captured in the terminology, at least. Sometimes it is captured in the, and it's often captured in the narrative. So, so one point that I think we need to understand is that the idea of very specific jobs and very specific work allotted to different people is not something in the earliest round of texts. You just get a sort of lump. And it's useful to see this as some kind of a continuum. In fact, the notion is very clearly a continuum. It is not absolute freedom on one side. If so, I mean, someone who taught the social formations course, we were always looking at it from the point of view what Greece did in terms of its institutions. There is very little indication of absolute freedom on one side and absolute unfreedom on the other. You know, that polar division is not something that we see in the text, in the early Indian texts. It is shaped, it's much more a continuum, and I think that the idea of the continuum in any case in many situations applies much more easily, because the way institutions come into existence do not, they reflect the historical experience of that soil and of that location, and including things like factoring in caste and so on. Once caste comes into a fair degree of consolidation, the idea of statuses which are absolute and fixed but are economic statuses as distinct from inherent statuses. That's a point that we could make. So if I'm, the difference between a caste category and a category like Dasa is that there is no one-to-one reflection of who the Dasa was, which classes it was drawn from, or which castes it was drawn from. And this is particularly important because when you think of, I mean, the term Dasa is actually originally a name for an entire aggregate of people. It was a tribe. So the Dasas were a tribe who were conquered or were subjugated by the Aryas, and so Arya and Dasa became like two categories in conflict with each other, one subordinated to the other. But the same category, and then there's Dasyu, and then finally Dasa is a way in which you refer to aggregates of people who are performing. It's very clear that they are associated with the performance of labor, that's for sure. And labor, and to that extent, and the fact that you could have various types of unfreedom that are built into you. So if one looks at that, one of the interesting things is the battle between the Buddhists and the Brahmins, the Brahmanical claim for inherent status, which is challenged always by the Buddha as you can't, the Brahmin is not born Brahmin. It's a running battle that you have in the Buddhist texts. is linked to also, interestingly, an analogy that he gives when the Buddha is arguing in this case that you are not, nobody is born a Brahman. Brahmanhood is not inherently acquired. Brahmanhood is actually an acquired, inherently achieved, born into. It is an acquired status. And when he is arguing that case, it's interesting that when the Brahman is saying, I am Brahman by virtue of my birth, he responds by saying there are only two categories in Ionia and Cambodia. It's interesting that he's referring to Ionia and Cambodia. And he said there it's only Aryas and Dasas, masters and quote-unquote unfree people. And the Dasa can become an Arya and the Arya can become a Dasa. So he's clearly referring to an economic status which can be reversed. Situation that can be reversed. So it is not something to do with a birth-born permanent stigma that stays with you forever and never. So that's an interesting dimension when we think about it. So then how do we actually look at questions of the servant's past, as the frame here is. There are farm servants also, and people do use the category called farm servant. But what do we mean by that? Is the same person who actually works in the house or in production in some form of collection of grain or threshing or whatever it is, but not someone who performs labor within the household, to be regarded as a servant who can do this. That kind of clarification is not something that we get even in the narratives. We do not get that very clearly. What you do see is an attempt to define the roles of people and define the levels of exploitation also. So it's an interesting thing. The ever-pragmatic Arthashastra, for instance, which is very clear that it's maximizing its exploitative characteristics, but it must be administratively governed. So there is an ideology of keeping it in certain contained ways. We'll describe some of these, say what kinds of work can be given to what kinds of people. And so because even someone who might be a free person can descend to service, performance of service, you must contain the level of and the kind of exploitation that you can draw from that person. I'll give you I'll start with an example. I'll just give you an example that might clarify this for us. Everybody knows the story of Draupadi and the question that she asks in the Sabha. We must actually read this. It's particularly important for me, and it was part of the work that I tried to do, is to actually look at what is the nature of the contradiction, what is the nature of the crisis that is being posed through the question that Draupadi asks. Now, it has been treated as this fiery woman who asks a fundamental legal question, and it is something that traps everybody because they don't know how to answer that. And the world over, lots of people, from what's it called, from interpreting Draupadi as a feminist, someone who sort of stood for literally the rights of all women, which is complete hogwash, because it's complete bakwas, because she's not at all standing for anybody's rights except herself, okay? Except of herself as a Kshatriya princess. But what is it? What is happening over there? The quote-unquote the free person, the Kshatriya woman, even the Kshatriya woman, can descend to performance of service, is actually running thread. And the running thread is interesting because, and its immediate relationship to sexual violence is also a thread right through, because it is it is Draupadi, when she is in the court, when she has to assume the status of a Dasi in an earlier moment before the Sabha crisis happens, when all her husbands are performing bits of work which are in some ways, I mean, Bhima has become the cook because he loves cooking, or Yudhishthira has become the becomes a flunky to play Dyson, or Arjuna's teaching, whatever it is. She joins the household of the queen, and it is in that position that she is actually the first sexual overture is made to her. So the status of the status of the married woman or the status of the free woman is very different, quote unquote. I'm not, for lack of better, easy words that I can choose at this moment. The woman who's supposedly the chaste good woman from the genteel parts of the society, when she becomes vulnerable is when she is in the form of she's performing the Dasi labor. So it's at that stage that she's there. And in a parallel situation, Damayanti, who also is enslaved for a while, she actually states that she will not do servile labor, and she will be protected from the overture. This is a bargain that she does with the queen. And she says she will not actually dress her and do those forms of labor for her. She won't do servile labor, and she will not also, the queen has to protect her from sexual overtures. So the point here is that how do we look at questions of Dasidam, and when Draupadi then famously asks a question, he was enslaved before he staked me, so he's lost his control over me, okay? Therefore, I cannot be enslaved. Therefore, I am not a Dasi. Basically, the claim that she's making is I am not a Dasi. Now, even someone like Iravati Karve, who's so sensitive and so interested in the woman's question, for her time, says this is she's lalkarifying lalkarifying means she's kind of challenging, and for those who don't know what lalkar means, she's actually taking on this court filled with sort of learned people, and that it's a sort of she's not sympathetic to the question that she raises. She sees it as some kind of an outrageous moment. I don't think it's outrageous in that sense. What is interesting is that she's saying, I cannot be reduced to Dasidam. Now, everything before and everything after will indicate that that's a question that holds not only the question of labor, but the question of the availability of one's sexuality. And that's critical for me. That's absolutely critical for me. Because she's saying, and before that, you must remember that the last thing to be staked is after, what's his name, Yudhishthira, is Draupadi. But before that, everything has been given up. And if you look at the scale of things that's been given up, it begins with material possessions of various kinds. It goes from, and then finally comes to it's gold, wealth, everything except Brahmins. By the way, the Brahmins are not staked. Huh? Everything is staked, and it rises in its what would you call it, intensity. And Dasis and Dasas have already been staked. Okay. Now, there's no question around what are we saying about these characters. But when she asks this question, I am not a Dasi, she is actually challenging what is going to happen, what has happened, that is the sexual overtures that have been made to her. She's been dragged in her state of the menstruation. She's been dragged into court with that one single garment. which is an act that is seen as particularly reprehensible. But it's also followed by then what Duryodhana does, which is he bares his left thigh, which stands for the phallus, and invites her to come and sit on it. And the entire discussion at that time is, you belong to us now, and we can do with you what we want to do. And that is what you can do with dasis. They don't have any rights over themselves, including their sexuality, and that is a fundamental question that is actually posed in the critical discussion, in the critical manner in which the legal question is posed, and the manner in which we should read it, because it is preceded and followed by indications of what it meant to be a Dasi woman, what it meant to be done. Now, this is very well paralleled with the Buddhist narrative tradition, where it's very clear that they performed all kinds of menial labor. There was no agent, hardly any agency. I'm going to stay with the Dasis because I've thought about them a little bit more. Questions of, sort of doing hard manual labor for women. And it's also very interesting that who looks for a Dasi? It is the wife who wants the Dasi to be brought in. So there's, in the Vesantara Jataka, for instance, it's treated as a great act of charity on the part of, and greatness on the part of Vesantara, that he gives his wife away to labor for somebody else. But the more interesting question is why this old crotchety Brahmin who's married a young woman, and she's using her sexuality over this guy, and she's saying, I'm not going to do this work, you get me a Dasi. So basically women pass on their labor in the system of the private and the public. The private sphere, domestic labor in the hands of women, and field labor in the hands of field labor or field management in the hands of men. The question that is the way she asks for someone is that she's going to then do the menial jobs, the hard work, and this woman is going to be able to escape the burden of the household. So the household as a site of reproduction of the caste, the community, and really the site of social reproduction is the one in which you are seeking to bring in the woman, the Dasi woman, who's going to perform this labor for you. And that is, 5 minutes, yeah, that 5 minutes is a lot. I'll tell you a couple more stories and then I can stop. So that's, I think, an important sort of thing that we should keep in mind. The mistress's power over now, I've said enough about sexual violence, and it's a running thread even in the Buddhist texts, because the masters are constantly trying to sleep with the dasis. But the more important thing is that the women are often then furious with the dasis because the masters are not being faithful to them. I mean, there's a way in which they're sliding the relationship. They're not taking it as natural, so there's anger that is displayed. But I'll leave that as it is. I think the perception of exploitation, and I would want to just end on that. There is a very clear understanding that this is not the natural order of things. That it's not, we don't take it for granted that this is what we have to perform. And that is actually, to me, the most interesting dimension of the narratives that one can read. There's this, the dasas do it also. There's, a very interesting description of freedom and unfreedom posed in the form of the king and the dasa. So the slave, the dasa of Ajatashatru says, he's a man, so am I. But he lives in the very enjoyment of his full life, the full enjoyment of his senses. And here am I stand and I watch his very look, because I have to respond to this every whim of the master. So from that kind of situation to a lovely story of this woman called Kali. It's mentioned as she's a Dasi. Her mistress has this great reputation. So I'm bringing in the relationship between, let's say, the household as a site of conflict. The mistress is got this fantastic reputation for being very even-tempered and gentle. So the world knows her. Everyone knows her as this, the mistress of Kali is very, very, such a wonderful, she's an epitome of how women should be, gentle and forbearing and, sort of, so good humor. So, but one day Kali decides, is this mistress of mine really so gentle-tempered? Is she really so nice? It's because I do my work so well that she is like she is. She is who she is. And so she says, let me test her. So 3 mornings in succession, she gets up late. So the first morning, the mistress says, hey, what are you doing? Like a slight crack in the good temper. Next morning, it's even later. The third morning, she just takes out the kunda. The kunda is the latch from, the big bolt that on a door. And she takes that out and hits Kali on her head. And blood starts to flow. Kali then goes into the town, displaying her blood-splattered head and said, this is the real good temper of my mistress. And she's not only shown that the mistress's reputation depends on her, but the mistress is also someone who actually is, she's riding on the work of the perfect work of this work. So, this morning. And one last account, because I love this story of her. There's this little slave, little girl, it's not little. Another interesting thing is that you use the term little for the slave Dasi. She may be an older woman, she may be whatever, but it's littling the work, littling the situation. So Punya is a Dasi. She's a Kumbha Dasi. Now, a Kumbha Dasi is one who goes and fetches water from the river on a regular basis. And so this is at hard labor for, in a hot climate, you need a lot of water. And so she's constantly going up and down, fetching this water. So every morning she goes to the river and she sees, and she's the Dasi of Anathapindika. Anathapindika is a very well-known, generous patron of the Buddha. Okay? So he's actually feeding the Buddha and whatever it is. So Kumbha Dasi, so you can see the social relations right there. So one day every morning she sees this Brahmin taking a dip at 4 o'clock in the morning, shivering and muttering to himself. So she says, so she watches him, and after a few days she says to him, see, I come here for fear of my mistress's blows. I come here at 4 in the morning and collect this water when it's cold and whatever. Why do you come? What makes you come and do this, And why are you sort of doing whatever? He says, I'm doing this because I am seeking to correct my merit and wash off my sins. That's why he's muttering and whatever it is. She says, oh, that's very interesting, because then it means that all the fishes and tortoises who are living in the water, they must be going straight up there, because they are constantly in the water. And then the water must be very discerning if it washes off your sins but leaves your merit to be accumulated. So it must be really very, very, very clever water. And the Brahmin is, and in the storyline, of course, there's a nice Buddhist gloss to this, but in the storyline, the Brahmin realizes how stupid these meaningless rituals are and decides to sort of give up his beliefs, and actually says Punya can be his teacher. But she's too modest and she doesn't take him on as a student, leaves him where he is. But it's an interesting story, and it's a metaphor that has surfaced throughout North India. I heard it in Pakistan. I was told that it's part of the Sufi repertoire also. The same story of the rituals, the meaninglessness of the rituals. So that has stayed as an important element in the storyline, but the dimensions of the actual debate And what is it that she's saying? That I am forced to come here for fear of my mistress's blows. Why do you come? Is a story that's gotten obliterated. And I think that's the way, these are just some ideas that I've tossed out to think about how we look at household labor or service. Thank you very much.
It's a really hard act to follow, Uma. So, well, for different reasons. I'm looking at a period which is much later in time. Well, not much, it's somewhat later in time. But it seems like actually much further away because of the nature of the materials that I will be working with, that I work with. So I write on the period which is the pre-Mughal period, which is from, let's say, 1000 to 1500. That's the period that I work on. And the sources that I'm using are largely chronicles, or, I mean, they're textual materials, so they're largely chronicles, they're biographies, or they are accounts of Sufi saints. So they're very narrative and they're very elite in scope. So I don't have as much vivid detail about, say, domestic service. What I do have a lot of detail about is elite service. Now, that's my qualification, but even then, if I take a look at elite service, the materials are not immediately obvious. So just as an illustration, a historiographical illustration, in medieval historiography, it was relatively unremarked until the 1980s, until the 1990s, that the fact that our Delhi sultans were of slave background could be of any significance. It didn't matter that they were slaves. It was mentioned that they were slaves, it was mentioned that they were Turks, and people moved on to talk about other things, institutions of the state. So it's only in the 1990s, and largely through the impact of work that was happening on Mamluk Egypt, that people scratched their head and said, well, maybe there's a story here that needs to be explored further. So in other words, the point that I'm trying to make is that actually, unlike modern history, sources on service are extremely, extremely rich for the medieval period. And sources not just on service, but sources that actually spend time talking about different gradations of service are actually very rife. And this is elite work that I'm talking about. And this should not surprise us, because if you should just stop for a minute and think that it was the servant of today that often turned out to become the sultan of tomorrow, that people would actually spend time and say, you know, how did this happen? Or better still, the ways in which they would gloss over this transformation. That itself becomes really, really interesting. So, the point is that all of this detail is embedded in our sources, but our sources don't yield this information automatically, which is why it was for a long time ignored. But the methodology which actually helped to unpack much of this is prosopography. In other words, moving away from the narrative line of the sources themselves to step back and write biographies of the individuals, or to reconstruct the biographies of individuals that are present in the narrative sources. So in other words, it's trying to move away from the discursive thrust of the particular text that we have, and to move into reconstructing the lives which these narratives might seem to obliterate. So, to begin with, as one uses prosopography and starts working with slave or social menials, people that I refer to as social menials, one of the paradigms in the, let's say, in the discipline of slavery, which was extremely influential, was that of Orlando Patterson, and one had to move away from that. Orlando Patterson's idea about alienation and social death was useful up to a point in trying to explain why people are going towards it, why people are moving in the direction of patronizing social menials. And the social menials, I mean, a body of people that the Persian literati who are writing these texts would turn around and say that these guys are of low birth, these people are useless. And so they're referring to largely those who are rustics in the broad term. And there are different categories of people that are always referred to as rustics in the worst, hideous possible manner. So Mongols are referred to as, social menials of guns that were in the same way. All kinds of frontier people, pastoral people, or all the rustics. Anyone that's not obeying is described in that particular way. So to move away from, let's say, the largely synchronic model that all Anglo-Saxon had is actually was very important. And of course, I mean, as the literature on slavery grew, you realize that there were different models that one could follow. And of course, coming from the work in Africa, you realize that we're not talking about, to understand slavery, we have to move into the diachronic mode. So if natal alienation is one part of becoming a slave, or social death is one part of becoming a slave, the interesting thing about the history of slavery is the ways in which slaves move away from this alienation, the way in which they seek life, they seek attributes which will give them greater social positions. In which case, the period that I'm working on gets to be actually really interesting, because and it's funny because one goes around and takes a look at subalterns and say, you have no idea how we study subalterns in our world. Because the ways in which we study subalterns in our world is one where from the sense of being like commodities, these people can actually re-engineer their lives, establish roots, establish households, develop networks, and emerge as sultans. How does that transformation happen? So that gets to be actually a key part of what I'm working with. The other thing is, as I try to understand these transformations, these social transformations, and the engineering of power, it's equally important to talk in terms of the ways in which our sources, the Persian literati, are responding to these changes. Because, let's put it very crudely. There are those who are for the Sultan and there are those who are against the Sultan. And then there are completely different takes on the way these qualities of monarchs are being appreciated. And those that are ranking for it are almost systematically never going to talk about genealogy. They will never talk about birth. They will never talk about social origins. They will never talk about backgrounds. They will look for different kinds of ways in which they can talk in terms of moral attributes. So here's a person who God gave these qualities, or this man who has these innate abilities which, given public responsibility, which sort of manifested themselves. So there are different ways by which those who are speaking for a monarch will talk about it, and those who are not speaking for the monarch will find ways about how you can't ever get away from your birth. There are these actions, and of course blood will tell. And of course, the culture of breeding is something that can't be faced. So different ways by which, but it's a discursive arena in which this dialogue is taking place that gives you a sense about how status is being appreciated. Now, as I worked through all of these materials, it was actually really interesting or important for me to be very careful about the terminologies that were being used, because there's nothing accidental about it. Since status is so important to these people, there was no confusion in the way in which people were being referred to. So when someone is being talked about a banda, it's quite clear that this guy is a slave. But then equally it gets to be really important or really interesting when someone who is manifestly not a slave is being referred to as a slave. You stop and say, why? Or for that same reason, if once you become aware of this, you ask yourself, why is it that someone's social origins are being reconstructed in this way, whereas in others is not? What is it about this person that, and of course, it is really interesting from that point of view, very few of us here reflect on the fact that the great Amir Khusro was the son of a slave. That is a detail which not a single Persian chronicle will ever mention. But they will mention so many others. They will say, who the hell do you think you are? You are, after all, a Maulazar, the son of a slave. And that epithet itself will cast you into a kind of a position. So there are different ways. They will say, so, who do you think you are? You're a new Muslim or a non-Muslim. And that's another way of actually distancing you. But these are ways in which you have aspirants who are in service, looking to actually position themselves in a different way, whose social origins are being talked about and discussed at great length. Now, the term that I use the term that I use to try to understand this service culture is derived from slavery. It's a term that I use which is called bandagi, and it's a term which is present in our sources. And I like this term a great deal because it also gives me a sense of the dynamic, the pulls and pressures that exist within the term bandagi. It's a term which is actually really, really interesting because it carries a very specific religious connotation. Bandagi is a term which is often used to refer to anyone who is a devout Muslim. So it's a way by which the devout Muslim is reminded of the fact that he is nothing else but a servitor of God. Okay? All of us, all good Muslims, are after all servants of God. Now, this is a term which has then the potential of completely effacing this whole idea of slavery. And it's a term which can actually be used in that way, but it's never used in that. It's never used to efface slavery. In fact, it's used, or let me rephrase that, it's used to efface slavery, but it's used to capture another aspect of slavery, the sense of loyalty that's supposed to be part of slavery. It keeps that afloat. It keeps a sense of self-abnegation, which is part of slavery afloat. What it misses out, what it loses out, is unfreedom. So bandagi is a term that continues to be used in larger contexts, in larger milieux, or the idea of bandagi will emanate in different ways, that someone is a very loyal servant, he is like a slave. So in papers that we heard yesterday, there were individuals that were recalled as they are like gulam-like. Gulam-like, another word for a slave, that gulam-like in their service to the masters. Again, a recollection of the sense of loyalty, trust, self-abnegation, that they put the master's cause before their own. All that is in the making of great service. But I mean, that's one part of the story that runs through this period that I'm looking at. There's another part of the story which is coming out from a whole body of people who are actually, of great social background. I mean, they're like aristocrats in different ways. I'm using the term aristocrats in quotation, but it does have significance later on in a more precise way. But these are people, let's say, of free birth, of high standing, they have learning, and they're in service. Now, these are, for want of a better word, let's call them secretaries, the secretary classes, or people of the pen, who do a variety of tasks. But they have learning, they have skills which are in demand, and they are certainly not slave-like. They're certainly not slave-like, and there is a clear recognition of the value of these people, and that will cut across time. That these are people whose services you need, they're extremely important for the creation of political structures. But in a sense, because they have this, let's say, this virtuous ability, they can actually negotiate with the masters. They can negotiate with their patrons for better positions. In other words, so that they can keep their identity alive, which is something that is lost in the sense of bandagi. If you're self-abnegating yourself, you're losing your personality, you're losing your identity. That's the ideal. In Naukri, if you decide to become a servant of someone, because you have these skills and these skills are so important to you, you will keep that set skills intact. But that means also that you never lose your identity, which means also that you can negotiate your service relationship with your master. In which case, a knocker has the capacity to actually negotiate his freedom, and his freedom will allow him a wider range of activity than that of the mother. Now, that may well be true, that knockers have this capacity to actually negotiate their lives, but it doesn't create for, let's say, ideal service conditions. Masters are looking for people that are not going to negotiate their relationships. So how does a knocker actually communicate the fact that he's going to be a willful servant? He does so by saying, I'm a knocker who will serve you like a slave. So in other words, ideas from one are then passed over to the other, but at the same time, when he says, I'm a knocker, I'm a free man, I will serve you like a slave, he will turn around and be actually well aware of the fact that he possesses these elements to negotiate. So he can turn around and say, I will serve you like a slave, but for example, I'm not going to cut my hair. I'm not going to cut my Sayyid locks. These, I will serve you. I will be, like a ghulam, but I'm Sayyid also. And these curls, they will stay with me. So, there are different ways in which these relationships are actually worked out. Now, I want to stay within the time limit, so let me just throw out some terms which start emerging as time progresses. So, if I'm talking about this relationship between Madagan and Nokri, I'm thinking specifically now about the 13th and 14th century. By the 14th century, and that's we're talking about, so those of you who are not from Delhi and who have been to Lodi Gardens, that's the period I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the Lodi Gardens in the 14th century. Actually, we keep talking about the Lodi Gardens, we should actually call them the Sayyid Gardens. We should call them Sayyid Gardens, that's where the Sayyid's tombs are. And actually, that's the cusp, that's the moment of transition. Because for the first time, in the time period of the Sayyids, in the 13th century, after we have monarchs that can actually go back and say, hello, you guys know who I am. This is my genealogy. I am from the family of the prophets, which is why they are located where they are located, which is why this place is known as Kher, this beautiful abode, which is why Karbala, when it came to be cited, is around that part. So that part of Delhi is actually sacred to the family of the prophet. We would call them the Shias, but actually it's a larger point. So when the Afghans turn up in South Asia and they link up with the Sayyids and they want to be buried there, then you're getting an insight into changes that are happening where monarchs of the first time going back and claiming a genealogy. They're proud of their lineages. So all of a sudden there are monarchs who are not socially dead. And chronicles are no longer playing with this thing about who are we and what are, and this is like a precursor to the kinds of developments that you start seeing under Mughals. So Mughals will talk about the genealogy, but we forget the fact that there is a precursor to all this, which means already the tension between Bandagi and Nokri is shifting dramatically in favor of Nokri. Where people will talk about their freedom, they will suddenly talk about, now here's the term which should be used more precisely, the fact that they are aristocrats. The fact that, I'm using this term in terms of the fact that they have these genealogies, and these genealogies give them weight and give them power. That's a transition that you start noticing as we turn into the 15th century. Now, this gets me the exciting moment, because that's when we find new terminologies coming in. It's at this time that you see words which had been used indiscriminately, a term such as chakor, which will come into more frequent use as we move into the period of the Lodis. Chakor, which is a term which you will find for the first time in Nizam-Din Walia's discourse, and chakor is a term which will be used literally for a servant, is a term that will be used here. But the way in which it's used will differentiate the chakor from the banda and from the knocker. Okay, there are gradations in which it will happen. So banda will be all of a sudden slide down the ladder, chakor will be the free servant, and knocker is the one who is like the banda, who's a free servant, but as loyal as a banda. That's the ideal. All of a sudden in this lot will crop up other words, where there will be people who will be servants, who will be serving, and they will say, we are of your qawm. We belong to your group. So there's association that comes from, let's say, being part of the clan, but perhaps not being leaders, but as a part of the group, we have rights. So they will say, terminology such as brother, are you a knocker, are you a brother? And they'll say, well, we are not actually brothers, but my knockery will clarify that actually I have stakes in your family. So these are ways by which gradations are coming up. What is marvelous to see as one takes a look at all of this is that there is actually very little opportunity for confusion. These terminologies are used very precisely. They will not ever refer to a Banda as a knocker, or you know, Banda as a charcoal, or one of these people as Balata. So they're very, very careful. And it's actually very exciting as one goes through these histories. Now, I just want to end with, you know, where my own work actually started, because, and that sort of pertains to some of the discussion that we've been having so far. What modernists don't realize as they take a look at the pre-modern world, and that's not because, I mean, that's for a very precise reason, is that there is a template in that society. I mean, I think Kumar was brought out from the perspective of Dasi. There are ways by which the grammar of relationships is talked about, which Western paradigms can never capture, right? Which Western paradigms can never capture. And the problem, I think, in my field, medieval field, is that we don't really have, let's say, a model that we can lay out there. We have feudalism, which people have been playing with, and they keep saying, not quite, but you know, they say, how not quite? And they say, well, not quite because things were transferable, you see. And they say, all right, everything else then is intact, right? So we turn on and take a look at Irfan Habib, and he says, well, the state was parasitic. These institutions were intact, so how is it different from feudalism? There's no further elaboration of this point. And so when we go back and talk about political economy, and I'm doing so in a very abbreviated way right now, we have to talk in terms of these cultural mores that are coming down all the way through. So if you start talking about Naukri in the 18th and 19th century, or we talk about Naukri in the Hindi cinema, and we hear a knocker saying, Banda Hazir hai, and we say, you know, this is the Delhi Sultanate speaking. How does that grammar last? How does that grammar last? And the comparison is enormous, because if you were to take a look at what's happening in feudalism, and you take a look at the origin of nobility, and you take a look at what's in the making of knighthood, one of the things that you discover is that how the idea of mine and ministerialis actually over time subsumes the fact that a lot of the nobles, a lot of the knights were of either social, medium origin or unfree. So whereas in Europe, as we have making a feudal nobility, the sense of unfreedom, the sense of slavery is completely obliterated. The idea of freedom is talked about at great length. That gets to be the hallmark of feudal society. When we take on these models and try to work them out in South Asia, we're missing this enormous disjunction. And that's a critical part that we have to keep in mind as we start talking about what's happening in the domestic sphere, what's happening in the public arenas. Thank you.
I should probably start by saying that this work I've done for domestic work does what historians have always been taught not to do, which is a kind of presentist approach. And my starting point was what Rafaela flagged yesterday morning as the discussions about slavery that began a couple of decades ago in the context of domestic work. In India, in the past 10 years or so, you've had newspapers particularly flashing headlines talking about slavery in middle-class homes. And this Delhi, in fact, has been one of the primary sites for that reportage. You have some amount of information about such kinds of exploitative domestic work situations for metropolitan India. In fact, though there is, I mean, one of the reasons the participants of this project need to be congratulated on is because there is virtually no history of domestic work in our context. But also though there is much more, the work on contemporary domestic work is also very patchy. And one of the things we absolutely don't know is the situation of domestic work outside the metropolitan context. This work has been heavily urban and it's been heavily metropolitan city based. So from that perspective, this little work that I did was an effort to see why is it that slavery has become in the 21st century such an important trope to understand domestic work. And what were a very preliminary examination shows is if we take the period from 19th to 21st century, which as a modernist, it's 19th century is as far back as I was able to go. From the 19th to the 21st century, but clearly for much longer, domestic work is characterized by a simultaneity of labor forms. So there's always slavery, servitude and wage work simultaneously within domestic work. And I began with Buchanan Hamilton, which was mentioned yesterday, and there is in fact considerable amount of information about domestic work in some of his accounts. And he talks about, he flags what Uma said, that there is actually no separation possible between farm, agricultural slaves and domestic slaves. But he also mentions three kinds of domestic workers. Free servants, he uses the term free servants, domestic slaves, and of bonded workers, so primarily of debt bondage. And he also talks about single households having all kinds of, a mix of these different kinds of domestic workers. His emphasis is on a fluid system. He talks about great local variation, multiplicity of terms. He has a long list of terms that are used in different districts. And he talks about the impossibility of categorical definitions. And he does not envisage an intervention in the system because, in line with the discussions of that time, he considers it a paternalist, particularly the slavery as a paternalist system. The other source which has information about domestic workers in a different way is the census. So from late 19th century, you do get numbers. I'm not going to detail the numbers here, but I think one point is important, and that is the feminization of domestic work is first reported in the 1931 census. Then if you take that forward, then in Bengal, and I'm afraid a lot of my material is focused on Bengal, the women are more than men as domestic workers from the 1970s. In the national context, that is a decade later. In All India figures, we see women becoming more than men, domestic workers, in the 1980s. Now what I'll do is I'll do three things, and I'll look at the intervention of contract legislation, the abolition of slavery, though the chronology is wrong here, and the question of trafficking. The contract question follows, in a sense, from Nitin's paper yesterday, and the other two issues will speak to many of the questions that came up yesterday. Now, in the 19th century, the first major attempt at regulation is Regulation 8 of 1819, which contains a clause specifically for domestic workers and provides for their imprisonment if they abandon their work before the contract has expired. And this includes some specific categories of domestic workers and what they call personal servants. Domestic servants and personal servants. And this law, it appears from the material around it, was designed especially for European households which were employing large numbers of servants. Now, Regulation 8 was extended rather than abandoned. And I make this point because it went in the opposite direction in England at the same time. When labour legislation began to develop from the middle of the century, and really it is Regulation 8 which becomes Workmen's Breach of Contract Act in 1859. It is also modified and put into the Indian Penal Code, which is the breach of contract provision in that code. And the thrust was to create tighter labour regimes which combined juridical notions of contract with penal regulation to enable, they themselves say, recruitment in a market oversupplied with unskilled labour. Now, neither of these two later legislations, Workmen's Breach of Contract Act or the IPC provisions, neither of these two actually focus on domestic workers, though the IPC does mention a few categories of servants. Now, colonial state remained wary of the discourse of free labour and contract as a mechanism of enforcement where these involved domestic regulation, preferring to allow paterfamilias to maintain his authority over the household and underwrite relations of personal subordination within it. In India, thus, the association of paid domestic work has been simultaneously with questions of wages, advances, contracts, and servitude and slavery. Since the IPC had left domestic workers outside its ambit, there began another set of discussions from the mid-1860s, immediately after the passing of the IPC, about reintroducing some of the 1819 provisions, which had been repealed, so to say, by the IPC. The government of Bengal was very much in favor of reinstating some of the 1819 provisions, but after much discussion, the Commissioner of Assam felt this needed to be done. It may interest people who work on Assam. And there were some other concerns like registration of contracts, what do you do with verbal contracts, how do you deal with the system of advances, which was being termed more as vicious, and penalties for breach where there is no fraudulent intent. The measures that were proposed at this time were intended to increase control over domestic and menial servants, but ultimately, after much discussion, the government of India shot down any possibility of alteration in master and servant law. From 1872, the judiciary began to enunciate what kinds of contract could be enforced in courts, further distinguishing between types of credit in labour contracts, between contracts based on loans and the ones that were based on advances against work. The magistrate set aside contracts where the rate of repayment was not mentioned, for instance, and where advances were to be recovered from wages rather than work. Thus, the High Court could annul orders that sought to enforce what they defined as exploitative labour contracts. Yet, of course, penal contracts continued, and we know this, finally abolished in 1925. In the colonial period, I haven't come across any other legislation that affected domestic workers, but it's, it may be there. Now, the issue of domestic slavery was also central to discussions of domestic work, and this was a constant theme in discussions in the 1840s. Abolition in England in 1830 was not followed by similar legislation in India, precisely because of the hesitation over domestic slavery. The question of domestic slavery grew more complicated as abolitionist rhetoric gathered steam and opinion in Britain, and because it became divided between Indian exceptionalism, India must remain an exception, and hardening juridical opposition to slavery. The company persecuted European slave traders in British India from the late 18th century, but they ignored indigenous slavery. Parliament adopted abolition statute in 1811 for British dominions. enacted as Bengal Regulation 10, prohibited the import of slaves, further extended this provision to Nautch girls, for instance, in 1823. But most of these were more or less dead letter. The company did not seek to enforce their provisions. But between 11 and 33, there were in fact several provincial acts as well. And none of these appear to have been enforced very much. The East India Company treated slavery as a domestic and social issue, very much linked to caste as well, and argued that this was sanctioned in Hindu and Muslim law. The Charter Bill of 1833 contained a provision for abolition of slavery by 1837. This clause was modified during its second reading in Parliament, and a comment was made which I think is critical to our understanding of this issue. The comment was that the Parliament enjoined the Governor General to frame laws and regulations for the extinction of slavery, having due regard for the laws of marriage and the rights and authorities of fathers and heads of families. This, I think, actually provides the crucial link. A consensus emerged that Indian slavery was domestic, alleviated by frequent manumissions, not comparable to modern chattel slavery, and it remained exempt from abolitionist legislation. The report on slavery in 1841 did very little to dispel such notions. The law in 1843 that followed abolished slavery, which means that it declared the status of slavery non-recognizable in civil or criminal courts in India. What it ended up doing is it criminalized coercive practices within slavery rather than slavery itself. And the IPC, when it adopted the law, took roughly the same route. That the law merely derecognized a slaveholder's right to assert ownership in human property through the judicial process. So you could not take your right to court, but otherwise it wasn't actually declared illegal. By and large, despite intermittent criticism of missionaries, the British approved the illiberality of Indian domesticity with its emphasis on subordination and discipline, and accepted domestic slavery as part of this larger domestic. At the same time, they observed it as mild and paternalistic, so there's contradiction here. Their approach to slavery was consonant with their policy towards domesticity. On the one hand, there was a policy of non-intervention, which was reinforced by states' unwillingness to change authority of local notables, like Lakshmi's case yesterday. On the other hand, the exclusion of slavery challenged many existing forms of familial incorporation, narrowing the definition of domestic to kinship, which speaks to what Sunil was saying a little earlier. So the two may appear contradictory, but in many ways actually they were not in the way they played out. The focus in all this was the elevation of patriarchal authority. Now, following Patterson, if we were to consider natal alienation and social death as the prime elements of slavery, then if you forget slavery and just say natal alienation and social death, what does it remind you of in India? Marriage. So, joint exogamy and village exogamy and virilocality, marriage is essentially natal alienation. And widowhood, as you have shown, is social death. So, the principles of slavery are actually encapsulated in the marriage system. So the equivalence with domestic relationships in larger terms with slavery allowed the state to, at one level, to domesticate slavery. So it was not just domestic slavery, there's an actual attempt to domesticate slavery. questions of slave trade, and this of course brought in the whole world of slavery into the question of domesticity. So slave trade, kidnapping, child stealing, all these became part of these discussions, and much of it exercised in this Radhika's work shows, exercised the British as symbolic challenges to their political sovereignty. So trafficking was something that was both a moral argument, but also a very important political argument, and it was constantly also getting entangled in understandings of kin networks, and became a convenient alibi in the way the colonial state addressed questions of slavery and trafficking. It was generally accepted by the British that domestic slavery was customarily a component of what they call the government of families. That is a part of the right of the head of the family and should not be termed slavery. Thus, slaveholding became indistinguishable from family authority and significantly spoke to forms of incorporation other than marriage and gestation in the family household. And of course, as a result, as you said, for the earlier period, this is very clear for this period too, there is a complete entanglement of domestic labor and sexual labor. At one level, the familial metaphor sanctioned the use of coercion and violence as emerging from the natural authority of the paterfamilias. This could be extended to minors even within the law of contract and to women in the rights of correction that the male head of the household had. So exercise of violence then and coercion becomes part of the story. At another level, slavery could be folded into the family through marriage, which involved the exchange of women. The ubiquity of transactions in marriage established a strong relationship between family and slavery. It became difficult to distinguish between the sale of wives and the sale of women as wives. There is considerable evidence in Bengal of trafficking in brides, which is well known. The various streams of trafficking in the end of wives, of prostitutes, and of slaves were virtually parts of the same process of circulation of women. This is not unique to India in the 19th century India. We see this in the 19th century in other parts of the world, very well documented, for instance, for USA. In 1871, I have to admit that the documentary base of this, or much of these arguments, is quite thin. But I find a case in Eastern Bengal in 1871 against somebody called Mir Farman Ali, who was accused of holding 4 women as domestic slaves against their will. The case, and he defended himself by saying these are wives. So the case sort of, highlighted the close connection between marriage, concubinage, and slavery, since slaves were often secondary wives, in fact. And the ubiquity of these customs, the case was discussed at length, and the ubiquity of such customs, and this is Eastern Bengal, so in Muslim households, became a matter for considerable discussion. And the legal difficulty of sustaining charges against slaveholders, even the slippery nature of the law on slavery, and the absence of any law or regulation of concubinage became virtually impossible. The internal trade in women and children was even more difficult to address. Children were sold throughout the territory by dalals, brokers, who presented themselves as parents or relatives. In 1833, before 1833, these sales were recorded, deposited with the kotwal, usually inducted into aristocratic families as domestic servants and or concubines, or in nautch troops, or as prostitutes in brothels. So the market for all these services was the same. The close connection between trafficking of slaves and the domestic domain often became problematic for the government. You do get stories in the archives of buying and selling of young girls, for instance, in Bengal. And there is a long debate in a Brahmo journal called Obalamantha, which addresses some of these issues. And of course, they became very important in the mid-1860s after the Orissa famine, when the government began to contemplate a law on the sale of children. The British were not willing to challenge transactions attending marriage and remarriage. But such transactions were distinguished from ordinary trafficking or sale and purchase. It often proved impossible, however, to distinguish compensation from collusive sale. So the divorce payment, like you know, if you have a bride price marriage, then if the woman leaves in order to marry someone else, the second husband has to pay the first husband a compensation. So these kinds of transactions became cloak for sometimes buying and selling. But in the nature of these transactions was such that they were proximate to buying and selling anyway. The difficulty of policing the zenana meant that the state was unable thus to control trafficking in women and children, whether for marriage, domestic slavery, or prostitution. And this evidence kind of indicates very close links between these three. Both Uma and Sunil have spoken of the difficulty of the polarization between freedom and unfreedom. The 19th century throws up similar difficulty. But the debates on slavery and unfreedom also speak strongly to practices rather than legal organization of domestic service, I would argue. Throughout the British period and after, domestic workers remain ambiguously under general laws of labour contracts. Formally, there is a transition, but the substance and forms of slavery remain entangled in waged domestic work. Extra economic elements of control remain here, as in other sites of labour, but very importantly accepted ideologically as part of this kind of labour. So one cannot postulate a trajectory at all from slavery to servitude to contract. But all these inhered simultaneously in this sector. And as Radhika has argued, the conceptual space of the domestic narrowed in relation to the state and the market. But there were also constant flows between them in the form of trafficking. So I would argue that we see three convergences. The preservation of slavery as a consequence of its characterization as domestic, criminal breach of contract being deemed unsuitable for domestic servants, thereby distancing the domestic from the regulation of contract, and third, from the 1930s, a feminization of domestic work. Thus, within the domestic sphere, the subordination of kinswomen extended to female servants, while men were released increasingly into realms of public labor, notionally at least governed by contract. During the colonial period, these were complicated by the highly unfree character of some of the contracts, but helped to mobilize labor for imperial commerce. The domestic too harbored a simultaneity of labor forms, slave and wage labor, which looked very similar in everyday practice because of the continuing emphasis on household authority. Now, my presentist bone, these hybrid labor regimes, I would argue, have shown great persistence, so much so that nearly 2 centuries afterwards, there is still slavery in middle-class homes. In West Bengal, for instance, in the last 25 years, we have had agricultural labor, even the police force have been unionized in the previous left front regime, but not domestic workers. And the state remains obdurate about recognizing domestic workers either as workers or as workers able to unionize. So their right to unionization has yet not been accepted. The only legislative intervention in the sphere of domestic work so far has except that in some states they've now been included in the minimum wage schedule, is the sexual harassment at workplace legislation. But the Indian state has been very, I mean, the domestic worker law has been in parliament since the 1950s, and we've not been able to pass this. It cannot be argued more that this is a reluctance to legislate the domestic. We have the domestic violence, we have all these dowry and, fairly draconian laws against domestic violence. But domestic workers have been suspended between the domestic and the worker in the eyes of the state. And the state's forbearance has allowed a brutal subjugation of workers to domestic discipline, which remains reminiscent of slavery. The great continuity of domestic work, which has been posited in the literature, has also meant continuity in labor practices in this sector. The trafficking networks the British had found so difficult to break, or indeed had desisted from breaking, have also persisted in contemporary India. If cyber coolies are trafficked from India across the globe by networks reminiscent of the Assam tea coolie traffic, domestic workers are sold and bought by means not dissimilar to those noted after the Orissa famine in 1866. The ambiguity of law and weak measures of enforcement remain, and slavery and trafficking continues to constitute a segment of the domestic labor market. And this is the main traffic from Jharkhand to Delhi, which is in fact the only one that is at least minimally documented.
I think all of us would agree that it was an enthralling set of presentations. Fantastic panel, thank you all. So we have, we can stretch it till 12, right? We started 15 minutes late. So we have about an hour, a little short of an hour, to discuss. So before I open the floor to discussion, I just wanted to flag one thing which has come through very, very vividly in all these three presentations, which is the complexity of conceptualizing service. What are we talking about when we are talking of service from across this huge range from slavery to the slave sultans. In modern times, and Samita's presentation actually puts it across clearly, in modern times the binaries between labor and service. Such that in modern economic jargon, service is merely distinguished in terms of its product, which is intangible as opposed to labor, which manufactures. But if you set that aside, even in modern discourse, the question of service is either in terms of range of freedom or unfreedom, or in terms of the question of intimacy. Whether the intimacy is of sexual exploitation, which is a kind of enforced intimacy, or a kind of, emotional intimacy that we saw coming through in some papers between the malkin and the maid, both in terms, in a sense, fighting the patriarchal structure of the family and so on and so forth. Or in I think very strongly, in kind of a politicization of the idea of service, which would allow Gandhi, for instance, to talk of seva and service as to gloss untouchable labor, for instance, such that untouchable labor would appear as service rather than labor, just as the elite's orientation towards the people would have to be of service. So in some senses, service is a really complex term, and in its opposition to labor, in some ways, are we within the ambit of what we have done as labor history? Or have we stepped out of the ambit? Are we talking of something else entirely? Or is service essentially a gendered thing? In the sense that it is a gendered work for somebody else. Is that the argument, as opposed to labor, which is in that sense gender neutral? So it's a very interesting set of issues that have come up. So let's take, say, 5 questions at a time, followed by brief responses from our panelists.
Before you do that, if you're going to push it to 12:15, we're going to really run.
Well, we can
Quarter to 12.
Ravikant? Okay, let's start. Ravikant was first.
Thanks. Yeah. Actually, a wonderful panel. I want to bring in the question of divine labor as well to the table. Because, Deen Dayal, Garib Nawaz, all these terms have always been around. And this ancient debate, right, between the Advait and the Bhakti is that so aham, right? That am I, daso aham, I am his slave, right? And it goes on. Soham, dasoham, das dasoham, das dasoham, etc. Sada soham, I am always that. So it goes on and ends obviously unending. So this liberation from alienation by divine labor, as it were. And there's a slippery thing happening in Bhakti, right? That Tulsidas is not the same Das as Surdas is, right? Or Meera is. Sham mohe chakar rakhoji, right? She is doing Madhurya Bhakti. She's in love with Sham, etc. So all these resources are very much there. I kept thinking of Utsav, listening to Umadevi, and all kinds of slave labor, including sexual intimate labor that we see, and the film ends in a revolt of the slaves, which is based on Mrich Katikam. So I wonder whether that is also not an interesting area to explore. Because all these sadhus go on talking about themselves, their self-image is about that of a das. So Mahant Nritya Gopal Das, right? So that has always been there, and whether they align with the whatever happening in the political domain, or there is a complicated relationship.
Yeah, I have a small question, again following on. So, it was a question and prompted by your remarks, which is, if service is a complicated term, and freedom, unfreedom is one axis around which one looks at it. Just listening to the last story that you narrated, it seems that the encounters that are possible inside and outside the home. So the site at which the service is performed becomes very critical for the kind of encounter that the Dasi can have. And maybe, paying attention to that detail opens up another dimension, because obviously these are tasks being performed inside homes and outside homes. So instead of looking at farm labor, wage labor, so whether that site is of some importance.
Okay. Reflect actually on something which Uma and Sunil pointed out. What struck me, and it's important to understand, the unmooring of slavery from its anchorage in particular productive regime and its metaphorization. It's amazing is how it can, what happens, you can talk about this grammar of, and that grammar can tell us, but what makes slavery get out from this so that it can circulate from divine to, what is it? So there is something about the power of this particular thing. So I would like to reflect on this. Why is it that the term slavery is not only that is translated across domains, but it can give life to different and with different meanings. This is actually, how is it possible? What is the both the structural and conceptual undergirding of this translation, this metaphor, let's call it metaphorization of slavery. How is it happening? What makes it possible? And you know, the same thing, that's why we always are actually caught up in this debate, both freedom, unfreedom, debate about where, to what extent you use the term continuum. But there's a brilliant article by Moses Finley, which is between slavery and freedom, which is actually, yes, that's a, so it's not about, he uses the term, but actually it is not gradations. There are many, they're not, it's not a spectrum which is teleologically linked. One end is ultimately polar opposites, but they are linked to each other. As if, you know, you can move from one end to the other. So the spectrum idea is actually not such a great idea to understand, sometimes, say. But this article actually is brilliant, and I was thinking, of course, you use that, he used one line, throwaway line about spectrum there, or continuity. But I was wondering, is it true when we talk about what she's saying about simultaneity? What is it simultaneous? Are they linked to each other like in a spectrum, like one shade going into another, or are they distinct, distinct categories? So where does, so because I find, given this, you know, how she presented it, it's a brilliant presentation, there are some ways we can actually find of trying to say what is it makes possible the term slavery to be used today, despite the fact that in already 1860 slave was criminalized. It was not that it was holding a slave became criminal in 1860 in the IPC. But what allows, the second point you made, what allows the domestic work to be continuously outside legal regulation. And this history is actually not merely absence of the, not merely the fact that the government did not, or colonial government didn't want to interfere, not merely because of the Indian exceptionalism, it is actually built into the law of contract. If you read Blackstone properly, already implicit in this is that servant is inside the fold of the house. Wife, children and servant are in the fold of the house. And their patria potesta remains, at least in the early. So that, this segregation of the domestic from the world is not something as a recognition of Indian exceptionalism, but is implicit in the law of contract, the way contract is. So it is not the division between contract outside and, say, the way, I like the term, but I think if we look at it, completed this history, we would have another way of looking at it. That contract is not mutually exclusive from these forms. So the men are going into contract and women are going into, is perhaps a bit overdrawn. If we look at it not instead of separation but folding, and you use the word wonderfully, folding into each other. So contract folding into each other. So there, both the question I want to ask is, what makes possible this translation, translation of the term of slavery? It's unmooring, and not to go to such extent, to have such a wide range of metaphorical life across time. What is it? Is there a real power? That's why the master-slave dialectic, in a way, works out, because actually, ultimately, it turns out the slave is the master. No? That's what Hegel ultimately meant, that the slave can overturn becoming the master, because the master loses touch with the word, the objective word. And slave family does that. And this reversal, one way of seeing this reversal is the translation, the power of slavery. Instead of saying slavery as I like the way that the rise of genealogical depth opposed to slavery. But still this slavery, the power of slavery, we should not, the lack of genealogical depth provides us a, that's what Orlando Patterson's point was actually very interesting. He said these are extreme. Even though they become sultan, they're still extreme slaves. He gives it as a real extreme. So my aim is just to look at, because of such a productive way you have discussed things, to understand how we can think of these translations. And how does this separation of the domestic from the, what is the actual genealogy of this separation of the domestic, or carving out of the domestic?
Thank you, Prabhu, for your presentation. Do we have any other question right away? Yes, please.
Yeah, just to follow up with that really interesting exploration of slavery, I think we need to be careful not to narrow the landscape too much and to consider the other kinds of symbolic sort of, and metaphorical work that we might see circulating in this on this theme. In particular, I think that the conceptual work done by kinship, by the idea of fatherhood, of motherhood, and also sibling metaphors, which absolutely abound in the cultural sources we have on domestic service. We need to consider them also as doing work beyond the family. Thinking about the British context, this whole the work that slavery does is always taken up in these debates about labour in the home in the context of white slavery. So there's also this kind of racial language which is seeking to create, to hint at a kind of euphemistic version of slavery which has sexual elements threaded through it. So there's a kind of specific discourse about slavery there that we might want to consider. And then we might also want to consider some alternative metaphors, and again I'm thinking about the British material which I know, and I'd be interested to see whether this is true also in South Asian debates, around the idea of wealth, the metaphor of the treasure, the servant as the treasure, or the jewel, which is consistently there in the language that's used to talk about domestic service, which does not want to use the kind of brutal term of servant or slave.
Okay, any other question?
Yeah, it's a great session, sounds like, but parochially I turned up just for Shomita's paper.
I'm very sorry about it.
So my questions really relate to that. I agree with Prabhu's presentation that there is a bit of categorical separations and analogies across categories, which probably obviate the overlaps and the contrasts a bit, in both directions. But what I would like to push, I mean, I'm very familiar with your work on contemporary Bengal, but since this is something new and you're actually traversing a huge range of forms of labor and of service, the only thing I missed there was, and that relates to something that Ravikant was saying, that divine slavery, there's Audie's work on literally divine slavery in Madras Presidency, when certain castes were had to provide very difficult service like cart pulling of the sacred cart and so on, and suicides and falling under the cart wheels and dying. That didn't deter the government from forbidding it. Similarly, not reading off from the laws, but which caste is allowed to enter into what kind of work, and would how much domestic slavery overlapped with field work, for instance? That is yet another question, because my impression is that in 19th century Bengal, at least, or in colonial Bengal at least, the Kamins, or the people who worked on the field, they were not, they included some women, and women who also took their food to them and served them. But these women were not allowed into the domestic space. So I was just thinking about that. And the only other thing, but that probably is something of an intangible, is since you brought in the analogy between marriage and slavery, the servant, what is the relationship between the mistress of the household, who is under one kind of slavery, one may assume, or some of the time, and her servant, man and woman.
Okay,
The conversation about domestic service from ancient to the current times, which we heard three excellent presentations. What I'm missing is the agency of those who are part of this domestic service. We heard a lot more yesterday than today. That's one issue I'm raising. Because we do know now that despite the fact that the state is reluctant to legislate, but those who are involved in domestic service, they are in some places in a way organizing and resisting and demanding. That I thought should be a part of any discussion, which I thought was missing. And secondly, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the idea of continuum of slavery into very contemporary times. I'm not saying it's not doesn't exist, but then, you know, as a historian, I also would like to see the extent of it now. Otherwise, we might, you know, sort of end up because there are many other forms of domestic services. And the slavery may be once now a smaller version of that which exists. Of course, there are exposures on and off we hear when a newspaper report or investigation takes place. But then whether will we consider the continuum the way it was in the 19th century or the earlier 20th century, in the modern 21st century? I know I have been attending some conferences overseas. There have been issues of bonded labor today in Scandinavia, in Holland, and in the countries where you will think it's not possible. But even those are not the dominant trends of domestic work or coercive work. You know? So why we recognize that these things exist, but then we only talk about them, and then you end up thinking for somebody less discerning that this is the only thing which is happening. I know they don't mean to say that, but the impression, if we are talking about in general, then I think it should be also put in a context. What's the extent of continuation?
Can I add? Okay, so then we'll just do one round because we don't have the time. So let's take a few more. First, then you.
Footnote to the last question. Like I was always wondering when we debate about slavery, how central is sexual labor and sexual exploitation actually to definitions of slavery? Because I think if we look at it from the angle of bonded labor or unfree labor, this is one angle. But then I think what you really brought in is the problem of sexuality and sexual exploitation. And yeah, maybe you could take that up in questions of how to define the deep of slavery.
I have actually a very quick follow-up to what Rana indicated. And this is to do with the idea of continuum, which seems to be his point of anxiety. And I was just wondering here whether we could think more concretely about recruitment. Now, the reason I say that is that, you know, like in Bengal, if you actually look at the evidence from Western India, slavery continues its thriving traffic right to the independence. And most of the slaves who are then bought are then sent as servants to aristocratic households. So I'm just wondering whether if we are going to push the idea of this simultaneity of slavery and servitude, can we then look at modes of recruitment as well in pushing this more concretely?
Okay, so can I write and ask the question since I'm here? I actually wanted to raise, and this is not specifically to either any of you particularly, but you know, do we also need to open up the concept of the domestic since we are crossing centuries in this time? Because while Samita, you talk about the middle class household as it emerges after a huge amount of regulation of the middle class household itself through the 19th and the 20th century, in which it becomes a domestic sphere in the way that it was not 100 years ago, such that it's Samantha Banerjee's work, the Power and the Street type of work, tells us there was an ongoing traffic of service caste women through the portals of the elite household of Kolkata and Bengal, who were kind of systematically then prevented from entering the crossing the threshold of the household, the nai woman, the fish woman, and so on and so forth, such that domestic service then becomes the maid's job in a way that it was not that simple in the earlier way. To the royal household, which of course is a political institution, which is not domestic in the way that we understand it. domesticity to be, where a certain kind of loyal labor, to the extent of self-sacrifice, produces a certain kind of political affect and political effect, which I don't think is entirely to the story of your Dasi, who actually constantly crosses the threshold of the household, who meets the Brahmin at the riverside and deals with the mistress at home. So, there is a temptation, Prabhu, to kind of end up talking about slavery, because that's the term which is the hegemonic term when we talk of labor question. But should we not suspend an overemphasis on slavery in order to then open up questions of what domesticity itself is? Which you did somewhere, you actually exactly this is what you were doing. So that's, yeah. So 5 to 6 minutes each from the reverse of this.
Yeah, a great deal of the questions were like common questions, so I'll do some and I'll let Uma and Sunil do some of those, other than those that were directed to them. So divine labor I will not, I think, address per se, except that to say, Tonikadi, that actually Devadasi illustrates, I think, the argument I was making in bringing these, bringing domestic labor and sexual labor within a purview of particular channels of circulation of women. So these channels are mostly trafficking, but not always trafficking. So forms of, even for marriage, certain markets in certain kinds of circulation of labor are not always through trafficking. And that links to what Lakshmi was saying, because, of course, if you want to trace continuity through recruitment practices, then the best place to look would be trafficking, because it has the longest sort of histories of continuity. Your question about the domestic, in many ways that is what I was saying, that appears contradictory at first sight, but isn't when you look further. Because at one level, what is a secular trend from the 19th to the 21st century is the narrowing of the household to kinship. So closer relationship between family and household. So more overlap between family and household. But at the same time, you have the transactions in and out of the household. Now, I think it's actually quite important not to conflate the domestic with the private. And the idea of women having the ability to transverse, if you like, the private and the public should not be confused with the construction of the domestic. So the domestic is not only a space, but it's a set of relationships in much of these debates. So in that sense, you may well have both mistress and maid having public access to the public in myriad forms. And at the same time have a constitution of the domestic within which these relationships are governed. And I think that is the tension that I think is happening at this time. Sexual labor and sexual exploitation and how central is it to slavery, I would say very. In particularly in the form of domestic slavery, I think it's not just central, it is part of the definition. So the domestic slave brings together domestic and sexual labor. And this is clearly because, and this is why there are so many forms of marriage. So you allow the incorporation of slave women into households and into domestic relationships through forms of marriage, which may not be primary forms of marriage. And that indicates the importance of, and this is pro-natalist, to use a modern term to describe something that is not modern. But it's a it is encouraging procreation. So for heads of the household to have children by slave women is part of the way household itself is constituted. So that's quite, so it's not only sexual but reproductive labor in all its meanings that is part of domestic slavery, I would argue. The question of domestic slavery and agricultural slavery and how do we distinguish these, this is very difficult. Tonika asked this question. There are the categories of female slaves we find in documents of the early to mid 19th century sometimes make a distinction between women who do domestic work and women who will work in the field. But whether these categories actually worked out in practice in this hermetic division is not something we know. I mean, the little work that I've done so far doesn't appear to, we don't appear to know at the moment how these distinctions happen. It's more clear in southern India actually. It seems to me from secondary reading that I've done that in southern India the division of domestic and agricultural slaves is clearer. In North India there is a difficulty of naming the agricultural slave as purely an agricultural slave. So slaves tended to combine various kinds of activities. But this has to be a provisional answer because clearly I don't think we've done enough in terms of looking at the sources. And your question about the relationship between the mistress and the female slave, I don't think one could give one answer to this. I mean, it would vary considerably, I think, depending on the nature of the household. But the one text that I find very interesting in exploring this question is Kopal Kuntala, which shows you the slippery lines between domestic slaves become mistresses and then change over again. And those transitions are part of the constitution of the domestic in the period after.
Right. I'm not going to take them in the order in which they were posed. I'm not going to take them in the order in which they were posed. I'm trying to cohere these into my abilities of responding to them. So, let me take up one set of questions which dealt with the domestic and say the public. Now, there are other responses which will relate to this. What you have to keep in mind is that as medieval historians, we deal with a range of materials. And they will respond to this in diverse ways. So, for example, if you were to take a look at Sufi materials, there you would actually have a more clearly marked out sense of domestic. Something which is private, something which is related to the household, would be more clearly discussed in Sufi materials than perhaps in court chronicles, where this will be sort of more clearly, more enshrouded in. So, for example, if I was to talk in terms of what is the sense of the household that comes up in the Sufi text, I could actually deal with that far more clearly. If I was to talk in terms of what is the sense of the household that comes out of a chronicle, that's almost impossible to carry out. Because, I mean, the way in which they would range would imply that, pretty much the whole world is part of the household. So there's a bit of problem there. Having said that, there are different ways in which you can talk in terms of relationships which are constituted in the household, which cut across different genres, and that might help us sort of delimit some of these questions. So, for example, questions regarding sexual exploitation, questions relating relationship of women in the household and slaves. Clearly, I mean, it comes out most evidently in both sets of text that there is sexual exploitation of slaves that's happening. It comes out perhaps most moralistically in Sufi texts where they talk in terms of legal boundaries regarding the sexual exploitation. How should it be carried out? What are the days in which it shouldn't happen? One should not be arbitrary about this. So these are outlines which should be sketched out. And such are the texts that you looked at yesterday. Fatwa Alamgiri would actually go the furthest in studying this kind of text out. What is actually most interesting is an observation that you made about nuclear alienation, social debt, and women. Because that actually comes out very nicely. That comes out very nicely through the medieval period. So, for example, when I did work on Razia, it was very, very interesting to see how all of the people that were fighting with her or collaborating with her, especially collaborating with this woman who became a monarch, were slaves. So she's turning around to slaves, to others who are of her same quandary, and finding associates to actually consolidate her position. I don't know if you noted in the paper that was presented yesterday, there was this point that was made by one of the speakers about how Rajput elite women, when they join a household, sometimes kept their natal identities alive. Okay. Now that was an interesting point to make, because it's not true of all Rajput women that join the household, and that was sort of missing in that presentation. A particular kind of woman kept her natal identity alive, which meant also not just links with home, but she brought her servants with her, she brought money with her, and that kept her identity alive. Whereas there's a whole bunch of other people whose identities were erased. They were completely like slaves in the same household, and that brings up its sense of hierarchy. Now, through these devices, you can actually go back and try to then cut through the sources that you have and talk about what are the outlines of the household that you're talking about here. Those are, there's been actually no work on this done so far, and so it's really an important question to get into. For the same reason, I mean, there's several questions that came up. Sites of encounters reflect service critically. I mean, that's absolutely true, because that's when questions are raised about what is your status, what kind of service can you perform, and that's particularly true for chronicles. You have to look at these, I would call them contingencies, these contingent moments where all of a sudden status will actually be revealed. It's otherwise something which is taken for granted and not talked about, but those events, those moments are extremely important. There's this whole thing about that you were talking about, and Tamika was mentioning about continuum and trying to work out spectrums and shades. Let's say the importance of, stay with the idea of slavery. I'm linking that up with Ramika, to your point about divine labor as well. Discursively, in many of my texts, slavery would really be erased. They would not talk about it, excepting talking about in certain contexts where they would like to either talk about the greatness of slavery, and that's when divine labor would be pulled out, or they will talk about it in the context of Namak, someone who is malicious, Otherwise, as let's say as a common day utterance, it just sort of disappears in a whole bunch of other metaphors. Now, that's actually the important point to figure out in terms of our relations that are being generated. Because if this was to happen, I wouldn't understand this. I want to understand what Razia is doing with these slaves, what's happening in politics of that, what's happening in politics of the household. So actually hanging on to some of these key aspects of slavery and service are really important to understand, not just how relationships are engineered, but what is actually at play. Why are aspects being engineered away? Why are some things always given this tenor of, this divine labor kind of thing? I mean, these are again frames of references by which different aspects of experiences will be configured. And it's for us to actually sit back and contextualize them and say, so, this is what's happening and these are the ways in which they will discuss it. And between the two, we will try to figure out what's happening in the politics of this movement. Maybe I can come back to all of these others, because there's a whole host of them which are more dispersed, and I do want to sort of just come
I was so hoping you would mention Razia, and you did.
We have actually quite overshot the time, but then what is to be done? There were lots of questions, lots of comments, even if you ignore the comments. On the divine labor, I mean, I don't mean it dismissively, but stay with the pinpointed question. So on the divine labor, I think it's interesting. Again, I can only draw from the Buddhist corpus. Is the play, and that brings this woman, the wife question quite interestingly. Everything is in that sense specifically locatable. But the drive towards seeking an alternative existence, seeking let's say, a liberated, a more emancipated existence is portrayed in the context of escaping from drudge labor. So drudge labor is the quality of wifehood. Drudge labor is the quality of domesticity. And it's not that men don't talk about drudge labor on the field, but the domestic as the space of a sort of repetitive and meaningless labor is quite nicely captured with the woman who says, I'm liberated from the pestle and the mortar, the silbatta is what I'm liberated from. But what is interesting is that maybe there is a suppressed story about self-cultivating labor, which can be treated as divine labor. But then she says, what do I want to do with that life? I seek akasha, I seek the spaces, I seek to expand myself. And to that extent, there is something over there around the positioning of the domesticity and the liberation from the domesticity, which I would read as the equivalent, because this is pre-bhakti. So bhakti has a certain mode of addressing godhood and addressing social relations in relation to, that is transforming everyday social relations into a kind of metaphor in which you and the god are put together. But this is all I would get. I think that question about the household and the site is an interesting one. Where is this, the location of the dialogue, or the location of the move out from? And in the stories that I mentioned to you, the woman who, the Kali who reveals the real nature of her mistress, it's interesting that the dynamics is within the household. So the work is being referred to as household labor, but the reputation is on the outside. So the world knows her to be an important, a very well-tempered woman, and its breakup, the demystification of that thing is also in the outside, because she displays the blood-spattered head in the streets outside. So she actually takes the exploitative relationship at home out into the open and reveals it over there. So I think that's really quite interesting. The wife's, Dasi continuum is actually quite interesting. Again, in the Vesantara story, it is the Brahmin woman who wants a slave woman, and then the wife is enslaved. So it's the wife then who is given away. Vasantara still has agency. He hasn't become enslaved, but he's provided his wife as the slave for there. So I think this wife, of course, that's a continuum that really is very important. I think all sexual labor is intrinsic, absolutely intrinsic to the woman laborer, and it doesn't matter whether she's in the field or she's at home. That's the important thing, and we shouldn't actually miss that. The household may seem to be the more intimate space in which it can be enacted, or it can be drawn from, extracted from a woman. But there is the famous account of in the Kama Sutra, which is practical as ever. Where are the moments where you're going to get this,
Chance per dance.
Chance per dance kab hoga? So the women who come and do vishti, who perform labor for you, and they are doing it it's a field-based labor activity that's happening at the threshold where the grain is being cleaned or whatever it is. These women are then coming from the field to the periphery of the household. The food itself is household. It means, it's part of the household. And that's the moment that you can seize the opportunity, as it were. So, and very directly, this is what the Kama Sutra says. So they are already bonded in some way because they're vishti, but they're also people who provide the opportunity, and then you do the chance per dance. So I think household, labor outside, what is domestic, what is not domestic, because after all, everything of the field will ultimately be domestic. So you can't actually break, do that separation very easily. And there's this the marvelous story of a man who leaves his property behind. He buries it in some place, and he decides that the only person who should know where it is, because he doesn't trust his wife, who will marry again, you see. And when she marries again, she'll take away his property. He must keep it for his son. So he tells the dasa where the material, where the treasure, where the property has been hidden. And so they go together. The dasa takes the young man, and then suddenly something happens to him, and he is the master. And he commands the boy, and and 3 days in succession, he goes to a particular spot. There he gets transformed. And then the son works out that this is the spot where it's buried, because when he's standing on top of the treasure, he becomes the master. He's become the master, and he is able to play out reverse the strategy. So I think it's very, but then remember, on the question of, I don't know about slave revolts, domestic labor cannot do a revolt. We know it from today. You can't even mobilize them. She's telling us about the CPM which would not, which would not mobilize, unionize the domestic labor. So that they are workers. If you can either be domestic or you can be a worker. You can't be the two. So that situation, domestic, I think the whole business of how then can revolt take place? Revolt is impossible, and we know that even from everyday work, everyday mess that women are in. Women don't constitute a class who can go on a revolt. They are fragmented by the household. So what the household does to women is quite dramatic, I think. But what form will you have agency then? The only agency you can have is to turn the system around through your wit, through your, Kali shows agency when she reveals the mistress's real temper. So that's the only way you can actually turn around and say, look, you don't really own me, I've got my own inner self, and you don't own me, and I have the agency to turn things around. Or Puya, who, teaches the Brahman. So that's the only way you'll get it. You're not going to get the slave revolt. And certainly you're not going to get the woman-slave revolt. Okay?
Okay, thank you. That's it.